Welcome to the next video in our series in the temporal learning module. This one is going to focus all about the three functions we've just discussed in the slides: temporal from start date, temporal from end date, and temporal from range. As you'll recall, all three of those functions create a new attribute for us, and they create their attribute from an existing entity and use that information to build a single attribute with change points. So what I've gone ahead and done, as you can see, is I've created a new entity called the personal circumstance with the personal circumstance start date and the personal circumstances as the containment relationship. So now I'm going to switch over to Word and we're going to create our first attribute. So the first example using temporal, I know this is not how I would normally name an attribute, but this will do, using temporal start date equals. I'll put this into conclusion formatting and I'll use the rule assistant to give me a hand. So I'll say TMP, temporal from start date. That's the one I want. I only have one relationship here, so in this project, so I can go ahead and pick it. And the date that I want is the personal circumstance start date, and the value is the personal circumstance. There we go. So it's important to realize that what I've done is I've taken the entity data that's in personal circumstances and I've used it to create a global attribute. So you'll notice that the first example using temporal start date, excuse me, is a global attribute. Let's close the Word file and go ahead and see what's happened in the debugger. I'll reset it and go straight to the Data tab. And my focus, therefore, needs to be on creating personal circumstances to begin with, because they are the data that is used to create the temporal attribute. So let's say that in the first instance, I was unemployed. And the start date of my unemployment was, well, I started work. I joined the active population when I turned 21. And let's say that I turned 21 this time last year, or thereabouts. And then I'll add another personal circumstance and say that I was engaged in some voluntary work, and that started in, let's say, March 15, 2020. And the final one will say that, well, you know, the voluntary work went well, so I got a job. And let's say that I got a job quite recently, in fact. So now I've entered my instances. Let's go and see what's happened over in the global attribute. You'll see that I have a new attribute, the first example using temporal start date. Recall that these three attributes have nothing to do with this example. They're the example from the previous chapter. And we can see that this data is fully temporalized. So we can see that the first example using temporal start date, I was unemployed from this date, starting on this date, because remember the function is called temporal from start date, so it assumed I was using a start date. Then I was engaged in voluntary work, and then I was employed. And I'm still currently employed because there is no there's no start date later than this one. Prior to the initial start date, the results are that it is uncertain as to what I was doing because there's no change point data available from the entity instances. Cool. So let's take that a step further. Let's go now and try out the second one, the second example. And the second example will also require me to go ahead and make some changes to my entity model, because I will also need to add a personal circumstance end date, because the idea of this function is it's when you have something which is representing an end date. So I've added my personal circumstance end date. And I can go ahead now and create a second example. The second example using temporal end date. And I know that's the wrong name. It should really be temporal from end date and from start date. From end date. Let's make it a conclusion. Equals. And as before, I'm going to use the rule assistant to help me. So I'll say temporal, and this time it's temporal from end date that I want. The person or circumstances. This time I'm interested in the person or circumstance end date, and I'm interested, as before, in the personal circumstance. There we go, and let's compile that, and let's go ahead and go to the debugger. The important thing in respect of these functions is you choose the function based on the data that you have or the data that you are able to procure. So this second example, which is temporal from end date, by definition, it's going to not look at the start date, it's going to look at the end date because that's the attribute that I gave to the function. But it also means that in order for it to work, you're going to need to give it end dates. So I'm going to go ahead now and give it some end dates. So I'm going to say that the first one ended in, let's say, 2020, March of 2020, March the 15th. The second one ended on in December. And the last one, just to demonstrate, I'm not going to give it an end date right now. And you'll see that when I look at the temporal visualization, the second example doesn't have anything. It doesn't work because it requires me to give end dates for each of my pieces of data. Of course, in my case, I'm entering static end dates, but you could imagine ways that you could calculate an end date if you didn't have one. So let's say today's date, at which point the second example becomes operational. And you can see that I was employed, and then I was unemployed, and then I was voluntary, because I've actually got the dates mixed up when I was entering the end dates, because it's the new year. So I'm going to switch that back to the end date will be today's date, which is 2021. And we'll see now that it's swapped over. Notice the difference in behavior is that the from end date assumes that because I gave it three pieces of information, I was unemployed, voluntary, and unemployed, it assumes that the first one was valid until it hit the first end date. Whereas the obviously from start date said, well, your employment or your personal circumstances started here because that's the start date you gave me. So everything in front of it is uncertain. As far as the temporal from end date is concerned, once the last end date is passed, it is uncertain as to what's happening now because there's no information. So you'll notice, therefore, that the two of them behave logically, but slightly differently based on the fact that one is looking for end dates, one is looking for start dates. Let's take a look at the end date as an example. What I'm going to do is go back to these examples now, go back to these attributes. I'm going to hide the first example from temporal visualization for a moment, and we're going to focus on the temporal from end date. Okay, so we're going to go back to the temporal from end date raw data, which is our three personal circumstances. And remember that the temporal from end date is only looking at the end date. So we're just focusing on the end dates in this example. I've got the 15th of March, I've got the 31st of December, and I've got the 14th of January 2021. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to change the end date to say that the end date is in fact sometime in, let's say, 2021 0101. Obviously, you'll see that the data has changed itself around to say I was on voluntary work, then I was unemployed, and then I was employed. So changing the source data changes the output of the attribute. But now let's go back to these and say, okay, I want the voluntary end date is 12/31, and I'll say the unemployed end date was 12/31 as well. Now we have a problem because two items in my input, so in my entity instances, shared the same end date, at which point those two have disappeared completely off the chart. And Intelligent Advisor tells me everything else is uncertain apart from the fact that we know that something ended on the 12/31 and my employment ended on today's date. So these functions are very sensitive when you have duplicate end dates or duplicate start dates if you're looking at temporal from start date. So you may need to massage the data in some way, perform calculations to add a day or subtract a day, or in some other way handle this. Now let's go back to our Word document and look at our third and final example of this. The third example using temporal from range. And we'll do as before, switch into the conclusion and go to the rule assistant, temporal from range. Personal circumstances, start date, end date, and it's the personal circumstance that I want. So we've created a third example, and this third example will, hopefully, we can now demonstrate it. We'll refresh the debugger. We'll go back to the data tab and we'll hide temporarily the other two, and we'll make sure the third one is shown. We can see that the third one has successfully displayed the unemployed and voluntary and employed phases, but because it's using both the start date and the end date, its behavior is a little different. You can see that between the voluntary phase and the employed phase, it's saying, well, there's actually a day that I don't know what you were doing. So we can go back to the voluntary data, and you will see that the voluntary ended on the 31st of December, and the employed started on the 1st of January. So in this case, it is interesting to have dates that all line up, because the way it reads the dates, logically enough, start date and end date, means that you're going to, where possible, want to have dates that line up. But obviously, as you saw a moment ago, if you don't have dates that line up, so 2021, 12/31, that's okay. That's okay, because you can have periods during your chronology where the status is uncertain. And you would just need to know that that can potentially exist, and you would need to manage it in your logic, or you would need to adjust dates if appropriate so that there weren't any of these. So these three functions, let's put them all back on the page now, all behave in similar but slightly different ways. And the behavior they have will depend on whether they're reading information as start dates or end dates or both, and whether there are multiple occurrences of the same, for example, the same end date.